Beginning St. Joan of Arc by Mark Twain, Chapter 1. The evidence furnished at the trials and rehabilitation sets forth Joan of Arc's strange and beautiful history in clear and minute detail. Among all the multitude of biographies that fright the shelves of the world's libraries, this is the only one whose validity is confirmed to us by oath. It gives us a vivid picture of a career and a personality of so extraordinary a character that we are helped to accept them as actualities by the very fact that both are beyond the inventive reach of fiction. The public part of the career occupied only a mere breath of time. It covered but 2 years. But what a career it was! The personality which made it possible is one to be reverently studied, loved, and marveled at, but not to be wholly understood and accounted for by even the most searching analysis. Note: the official record of the trials and rehabilitation of Joan of Arc is the most remarkable history that exists in any language. Yet, there are few people in the world who can say that they have read it. In England and America, it has hardly been heard of. 300 years ago, Shakespeare did not know the true story of Joan of Arc. In his day, it was known even in France. For 400 years, it existed rather as a vaguely defined romance than as definite and authentic history. The true story remained buried in the official archives of France from the rehabilitation of 1456 until Quiqueret dug it out and gave it to the world 2 generations ago, in lucid and understandable modern French. It is a deeply fascinating story, but only in the official trials and rehabilitation can it be found in its entirety. Mark Twain. In Joan of Arc, at the age of 16, there was no promise of a romance. She lived in a dull little village on the frontiers of civilization. She had been nowhere and had seen nothing. She knew none but simple shepherd folk. She had never seen a person of note. She hardly knew what a soldier looked like, and she never had ridden a horse, nor had a warlike weapon in her hand. She could neither read nor write. She could spin and sew. She knew her catechism and her prayers and the fabulous histories of the saints, and this was all her learning. That was Joan at 16. What did she know of law, of evidence, of courts, of the attorney's trade, of legal procedure? Nothing. Less than nothing. Thus, exhaustively equipped with ignorance, she went before the court at Tours to contest a false charge of breach of promise of marriage. She conducted her cause herself, without anyone's help or advice, or anyone's friendly sympathy, and won it. She called no witnesses of her own, but vanquished the prosecution by using with deadly effectiveness its own testimony. The astonished judge threw the case out of court and spoke of her as this marvelous child. She went to the veteran commandant at Vaucouleurs and demanded an escort of soldiers, saying she must march to the help of the King of France, since she was commissioned of God to win back his lost kingdom for him and set the crown upon his head. The commandant said, "What, you are only a child." Then he advised that she be taken back to her village and have her eyes boxed. But she said she must obey God and would come again and again and yet again, and finally she would get the soldiers. She said truly. In time he yielded, after months of delay or refusal, and gave her the soldiers, and took off his sword and gave her that, and said, "Go, and let come what may." She made her long and perilous journey through the enemy's country, and spoke with the king and convinced him. Then she was summoned before the University of Poitiers to prove that she was commissioned of God and not of Satan. And daily during 3 weeks she sat before that learned congress unafraid, and capably answered their deep questions out of her ignorant but able head and her simple and honest heart. And again she won her case, and with it the wondering admiration of all that august company. And now, aged 17, she was made commander-in-chief with the prince of the royal house and the veteran generals of France for subordinates, and at the head of the first army she had ever seen, she marched to Orleans, carried the commanding fortress of the enemy by storm in 3 desperate assaults, and in 10 days raised a siege which had defied the might of France for 7 months. After a tedious and insane delay caused by the king's instability of character and the treacherous counsels of his ministers, she got permission to take the field again. She took Jargeau by storm. Then Meung, she forced Beaugency to surrender. Then, in the open field, she won the memorable victory of Patay against Talbot, the English lion, and broke the back of the 100 Years' War. It was a campaign which cost but 7 weeks of time, yet the political results would have been cheap if the time expended had been 50 years. Patay, that unsung and now long forgotten battle, was the Moscow of the English power in France. From the blow struck that day, it was destined never to recover. It was the beginning of the end of an alien dominion which had ridden France intermittently for 300 years. Then followed the great campaign of the Loire, the capture of Croix by assault, and the triumphal march past surrendering towns and fortresses to the Rhines, where Joan put the crown upon her king's head in the cathedral amid wild public rejoicings, and with her old peasant father there to see these things and believe his eyes if he could. She had restored the crown and the lost sovereignty. The king was grateful for once in his shabby poor life, and asked her to name her reward and have it. She asked for nothing for herself. She begged that the taxes of her native village might be remitted forever. The prayer was granted, and the promise kept for 360 years. Then it was broken, and remains broken today. France was very poor then. She is very rich now, and she has been collecting those taxes for more than 100 years. Joan asked one other favor, that now her mission was fulfilled, she might be allowed to go back to her village and take up her humble life again with her mother and the friends of her childhood, for she had no pleasure in the cruelties of war, and the sight of blood and suffering wrung her heart. Sometimes, in battle, she did not draw her sword, lest in the splendid madness of the onset she might forget herself and take an enemy's life with it. In the ruined trials, one of her quaintest speeches, coming from the gentle and girlish source it did, was her naive remark that she had never killed anyone. Her prayer for leave to go back to the rest and peace of her village home was not granted. Then she wanted to march at once upon Paris and take it, and drive the English out of France. She was hampered in all the ways that treachery and the king's facilitation could devise, but she forced her way to Paris at last, and fell badly wounded in a successful assault upon one of the gates. Of course, her men lost heart at once. She was the only heart they had. They fell back. She begged to be allowed to remain at the front, saying victory was sure. "I will take Paris now, or die," she said. But she was removed from the field by force. The king ordered a retreat and actually disbanded his army. In accordance with a beautiful old military custom, Joan devoted her silver armor and hung it up in the cathedral of St. Denis. Its great days were over. Then by command she followed the king and his frivolous court, and endured a gilded capacity for a time, as well as her free spirit could, and whenever inaction became unbearable, she gathered some men together and rode away and assaulted a stronghold and captured it. At last, in a sortie against the company from Compiègne on the 24th of May, when she was turned 18, she was herself captured after a gallant fight. It was her last battle. She was to follow the drums no more. Thus ended the briefest epoch-making military career known to history. It lasted only a year and a month, but it found France an English province, and furnishes the reason that France is France today, and not an English province still. 13 months. It was indeed a short career, but in the centuries that have since elapsed, 500 millions of Frenchmen have lived and died, blessed by the benefactions it conferred. And so long as France shall endure, the mighty debt must grow. And France is grateful, we often hear her say it. Also, thrifty. She collects the Dommermy taxes. Chapter 2. Joan was fated to spend the rest of her life behind bolts and bars. She was a prisoner of war, not a criminal. Therefore hers was recognized as an honorable captivity. By the rules of war she must be held to ransom, and a fair price could not be refused if offered. Joan of Luxembourg paid her the just compliment of requiring a prince's ransom for her. In that day, that phrase represented a definite sum of 61,125 francs. It was, of course, supposable that either the king or grateful France, or both, would fly with the money and set their fair benefactor free. But this did not happen. In 5.5 months, neither king nor country stirred a hand nor offered a penny. Twice, Joan tried to escape. Once by a trick, she succeeded for a moment and locked her jailer in behind her, but she was discovered and caught. In the other case, she had let herself down from a tower 60 feet high, but her rope was too short, and she got a fall that disabled her, and she could not get away. Finally, Edward Kelly, Edward Talbot, whatever you call him, isn't that what happened to him too? Finally, Cochran, Bishop of Beauvais, paid the money and bought Joan, ostensibly for the church, to be tried for wearing male attire and for other impieties, but really for the English, the enemy into whose hands the poor girl was so piteously anxious not to fall. She was now shut up in the dungeons of the castle of Rouen, and kept in an iron cage, with her hands and feet and neck chained to a pillar. And from that time forth, during all the months of her imprisonment till the end, several rough English soldiers stood guard over her night and day, and not outside her room, but in it. It was a dreary and hideous captivity, but it did not conquer her. Nothing could break that invincible spirit. From first to last she was a prisoner a year, and she spent the last 3 months of it on trial for her life before a formidable array of ecclesiastical judges, and disputing the ground with them, foot by foot and inch by inch, with brilliant generalship and dauntless pluck. The spectacle of that solitary girl, forlorn and friendless, without advocate or adviser, and without the help of and guidance of any copy of the charges brought against her, are rescript of the complex and voluminous daily proceedings of the court to modify the crushing strain upon her astonishing memory, fighting that long battle serene and undismayed against these colossal odds, stands alone in its pathos and its sublimity. And it has nowhere its mate, either in the annals of fact or in the inventions of fiction. And how fine and great were the things she daily said, how fresh and crisp, and she, so worn in body, so starved and tired and hurried. They run through the whole gamut of feeling and expression, from scorn and defiance, uttered with soldiery fire, and frankness all down the scale to wounded dignity clothed in the wounds of noble pathos, as when her patience was exhausted by the pestering delvings and gropings and searchings of her persecutors to find out what kind of devil's witchcraft she had employed to rouse the war spirit in her timid soldiers, she burst out with what I said was, "Ride these English down, and I did it myself." And as when insultingly asked why it was that her standard had place at the crowning of the king in the cathedral of Rheims rather than the standards of the other captains, she uttered that touching speech. It had borne the burden, it had earned the honor, a phrase which fell from her lips without premeditation, yet whose moving beauty and simple grace it would bankrupt the arts of language to surpass. Although she was on trial for her life, she was the only witness called on either side, the only witness summoned to testify before a packed jury, commissioned with a definite task to find her guilty, whether she was guilty or not. And that's the problem with the idea of prosecuting attorneys, isn't it?